Thanks for joining us today. This is, as you would expect, the webinar on promoting local currency sustainable finance in ASEAN+3. We've got a bit of a big panel, but we're getting going in about 4 minutes. So just be patient with us. We're making sure people can join because there's a bit of a glitch with the redirect on the panel. So we're letting you in a little bit early. You get the wonderful joy of being able to see who's actually dialed in on our speakers list and admire the wonderful smile of Kelvin Lee in the Philippines. Okay, 3 minutes to go. It's getting close. I'm Sean Kidney. I'm the CEO of the Climate Bonds Initiative. I'm primarily here to keep you entertained until the panel starts in a few minutes on a very serious matter around sustainable finance. We're very blessed to have a high-profile lineup. Again, I'm just teasing you. You have to wait a couple of minutes until we get started. But of course, the whole point of today is to listen to how this market is growing and also how we can grow it, how we can make it larger. You kind of know the challenge we face. You can hear more about that in a minute. But are you aware of what's actually happening? You know, and look, I have to just talk about Kelvin Lee again for a minute, because of course the Securities Commission of the Philippines has been doing a lot. Although I don't know anything that happened in the last 2 years in COVID, so he's got to fill us in some detail about this to grow green finance. We're going to find out some more soon, let alone whatever else he's willing to share with us today. But he's not the only one, of course. Tomo Yamadera from the Asian Development Bank will give us a few introductory words in a minute. You know, it's a weird thing, this webinar world. We are scattered around the region, the planet, talking about this. We never meet in person anymore because we're sort of lost in the matrix as we just live in a Zoom world. So we've got to have a little bit of a laugh every so often just to keep ourselves vaguely human and we don't get sucked up by the internet. I'm, as you can tell, pining, yearning for the days when I would be in a room with Ivy Lau in Hong Kong, where she is, and we'd actually be talking live. But in the meantime, the advantage of doing these things on Zoom is that we can have a much larger group of people dialing and involving around the world and get our speakers from around the world without them having to fly and waste carbon miles. So today we're on Zoom. We do hope we'll see you all in the future as we embark on this journey, or rather pursue this journey to grow sustainable finance in the region. And now I think we're coming up the time to start. Louisa, our producer, can you give me the green light? Am I okay to get going?
Yes, you're good to go. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much. Attendees, people who've dialed in today, thank you so much for joining us for this panel. We have people from all around the region on the call. This is a webinar jointly organised with the Asian Development Bank and Climate Bonds Initiative on promoting local currency sustainable finance in ASEAN+3. You'll hear more about the detail in a minute from Daniel McGree, who's the Senior Research Analyst at Climate Bonds Initiative, who will present the report that we're launching today, which forms the substance of what we're going to say. And in a minute, I'll also invite my colleague at the Asian Development Bank to say some words. But look, just to get us going, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we have rather substantial environmental challenges. It's not exactly a business as usual world that we have to live in. If you are following the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that have been coming out fast and thick lately, we have some terrifying science, as much as science can be terrifying when you read it. It's dry at first, and you realize, hang on, are they really saying that? And yes, they are. The prognosis for climate change at the moment is very grim for our economies, our societies, our worlds. And it's important to note we're not talking about gently rising sea level. We're talking about catastrophically extreme heat incidences. We are talking about the famines, the wars, the pandemics that arise out of the way we're changing our planet. Be very clear. Pandemic that we've just come out of was caused by the collapse of biodiversity in South China and in the northern part of ASEAN. And the impact on animal species, bats in this case, and pathogens jumping between species and so on. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been telling us for 30 years in reports that this is going to happen, that we're going to see a 21st century of pandemics. This is not the last. There will be more. And the war that's being experienced in the Ukraine at the moment, at the end of the day, is a war fueled by fossil fuel profits. The amount of income that the Russian government has generated from selling fossil fuels to Europe in the last few years, way, way, way more than covers the cost of the invasion of the Ukraine. This is essentially a fossil fuel war linked to the change in the world that we're going through, the need to get off fossil fuels. And of course, it's driving change in Europe and in other countries in terms of exiting fossil fuels. It's part of the change, folks, is what I'm trying to say. But most importantly, most worryingly, is the extreme price hike that we've seen in food prices because of the war, because of the collapse of exports from Russia and the Ukraine, and how that's affecting people all around the world, especially in Asia. And what that means for the future. In some countries, we are forecasting famines, certainly in Africa at the moment, that's the case. This is all part of what we experience. The last time we had climate change in the 1600s, when we saw 2 degrees cooling, we lost a third of the world's population, as far as we can tell, around the world. That's a third of the world's population. What we're going into now for the region is severe. This is the most exposed region in the world in many analyses. We need to address the change. Now, of course, we know that investors are concerned about this. We have proof that if we create sustainable bonds, for example, or sustainable finance, investors will invest. I mean, look at the extraordinary demand for bonds issued by some of the Filipino banks, and I'm going to give a cue to Kelvin to speak later under their Green Bonds program, which have been driven by the understanding by the global investment community that long-term risk lies their portfolios if climate change isn't addressed. And one of the ways to mitigate that risk is to shift investments over to green investments that give them a good yield. And that's what we have here. The green, sustainable and social market is now $3 trillion outstanding globally. Extraordinary figure from nothing, 3 billion when I began this work at the Climate Bonds Initiative some 12 years ago. That is a massive growth and will continue to grow this year all around the world. Is it enough? No. We need to be seeing something like 10 times the volume of issuance to make this work. And that needs to include not just mitigation, but also resilience, preparedness for the kinds of volatility we experience, and responsiveness to things like the pandemic. We've seen in the region the equivalent of social bonds issued by the Indonesian government and others. We've got a long way to go, but we have got a good start. I'd like to just invite my friend now, Tomo Yamadera from the Asian Development Bank, to say a few bank as the joint sponsor for today's event and for this project. Tomo, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you very much for your comments. I very much concur what you have just said. First of all, I'd like to express my sincere appreciation to all the participants. Thank you very much for joining. I also would like to announce we just published a report on the promoting local currency sustainable finance in ASEAN+3. This report is the output of the collaboration with the Climate Bond Initiative. I really would like to thank Climate Bond Initiative colleague for supporting us to develop this report. This report, I hope, will be seen as a kind of some sort of the basic fact finding, the current state of ASEAN+3 bond market. For those who do not know about the ASEAN+3 and ABMI, Asian Bond Markets Initiative, allow me to briefly explain what we are doing. ASEAN+3 is the group of countries, ASEAN 10 countries plus China, Korea, Japan. We call it ASEAN+3. And these 13 countries have been supporting the development of local currency bond markets since early 2000. And the ADB is acting as the secretariat of this regional financial cooperation initiative. Well, currently, we are very much focusing on the development of green social sustainability bond market. And to support or to develop the market, we need to understand the current state. And I believe this report gives us good understanding what the current state is, and then we can benchmark ourselves how the market will develop in the future. For those who are not familiar with ABMI, ADB is providing various technical assistance, knowledge support, or sometimes very detailed technical assistance, developing the sort of green bond issuance guidelines, or for countries, we also provide support to develop legislation, laws, and regulations. We support potential issuers to actually go into the process of issuance. And of course, we support investors. And we are very much looking forward to create local currency green bond market together with the CBI. So today's event, I hope that you can get the sense what is going on in this East Asia ASEAN+3 markets. And through the panel discussion, I believe the panelists can highlight some key important issues. Of course, we can cover everything in this one-hour webinar, but hopefully you can understand what needs to be considered. And of course, ADB is always with you. If you need some technical assistance, we are happy to support you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tomo. And it's really important what Tomo just said, that the Asian Development Bank has been providing direct, practical, technical assistance, advice and support, and sometimes credit guarantees for issuance in the region. Really critical role to make this work. This webinar is being broadcast live on YouTube right now. It is also being recorded. It'll be available on our YouTube channel, Climate Bonds Initiative, and through other means. You can ask questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the page. Bear that in mind. The report is now published in the chat box. You can go to the chat, click on it, and download the report. We have a fantastic panel, some legendary speakers. Jason, he's legendary. I can tell you there's a lot of stories, but I'll leave it to Selena to introduce them all in a minute. First, I want to go to Daniel McCree. Daniel is a senior analyst at Climate Bonds Initiative, who's been the principal author of the report. Daniel, over to you.
Thanks very much, Sean. Good day to everyone. As Sean mentioned, my name is Dan. I am a senior investment analyst with Climate Bonds, who worked very much as a part of a team with fellow analysts and also in collaboration with ADB in putting together this publication. Today, I'll briefly highlight to you a few of the key findings from the report, but I would encourage each and every one of you to take some time in
Daniel,
We've lost you, Daniel.
You're on mute, Daniel.
All right, can you hear me now?
Go for it. Yes.
Okay, my apologies. As I was saying before, the publication is now available online. It is a lengthy document, so I would perhaps encourage you to consider it as a bit of a reference guide where you can direct yourself to particular sections, whether it be on a particular topic of choice or a specific country of interest, to learn more about how the sustainable finance market is growing and developing within the ASEAN+3 region. Next slide, please. In compiling the information for the report, it was fairly clear that the market has grown substantially since the last publication by the ADB to promote green local currency bonds in ASEAN+3 back in 2018. The landscape has shifted dramatically. Not only has the region seen a rapid amount of growth in green bond issuances, but also in social and sustainability labelled bonds. These themes have also served as a foundation for further financial innovation towards performance-linked instruments and also transition bonds. The report itself analyses, firstly, the current state and the recent trends of the region's sustainable bond market, before discussing some of the policies and the strategies for promoting local currency sustainable finance, before then looking at providing some insights into new opportunities for growth and recommended actions for the region's market development. Next slide, please. So observing some of how the market has grown recently, it's very clear that green bonds continue to, or have historically dominated the sustainable debt market. But the pandemic has catalyzed the next generation of social and sustainability linked instruments to fund a broader range of environmental and social benefits. The growth of green and sustainable debt has been buoyant in the last 2 years. And at the end of the third quarter of 2021, the cumulative sustainable debt market in ASEAN+3 had reached a size of $449 billion US. Social bond issuances were the significant driver in 2020 as a source of financing in immediate response to the impacts of the pandemic, while sustainability bond issuances have played a leading role in much of 2021. While the supply has increased, the demand for GSS bonds is continuing to grow from a variety of different sources. Greater investor understanding of climate risks, new fund launches, and broader market presence have all stimulated demand. But what is clear is that sustainable finance instruments can be further investment across the ASEAN+3 region can be underpinned by GSS finance frameworks and clear issuance processes. The creation of a transparent, sustainable financing approach and instruments is fundamental to incentivizing investment, as well as the transition to more sustainable practices. So the evolving market conditions have facilitated new product launches. This study covers an array of instruments, including the more conventional green, social, and sustainability bonds, before highlighting new thematic debt, such as transition bonds, carbon neutral bonds, blue bonds, poverty alleviation, and rural revitalization bonds. On the topic of the transition, the groundwork has really been laid for transition finance in the region, and it is more crucial than ever as entities seek to transition towards Paris-aligned targets. Transition bonds enable responsible investors to support companies and activities that are transitioning to low or zero carbon, particularly in what has traditionally been seen as high carbon emitting sectors. Transition debt the transition debt market has gained traction in 2020, and transition labeled bonds in the region now represent $1.7 billion of value. Next slide, please, Selena. When diving deeper into assessing the individual country experiences, the region's larger economy, namely the People's Republic of China, Hong Kong, China, and Japan, are the drivers of growth. This is true when looking at an assessment based on issuance size and policy, but also in general market developments. The PRC remains a clear market leader in sustainable bond issuance and was the source of $44.5 billion US in the first 9 months of 2021. More than half of this financing was earmarked for renewable energy and transport, which is particularly pertinent in the aftermath of the PRC's 2060 carbon neutrality pledge. Innovation is continuing in the PRC, such as the blue bond overseas issuance in September 2020 by the Bank of China and other rural revitalization bonds. Elsewhere, Singapore is a clear leader within the ASEAN bloc, followed by Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia. While ASEAN's growth has been steady and consistent, there's still policy space to improve the scale of sustainable debt markets. A couple of important issuances worth mentioning from 2021 include Indonesia's 5th sovereign sukuk under the Green Sukuk program, worth $750 million US, and also another one focused on local currency financing, being Singapore's National Energy Agency's first green bond in September 2021 to the value of 1.65 billion Singapore dollars. Next slide, please, Selena. Local currency sustainable bonds debuted in ASEAN+3 in 2014, but issuances only really gathered pace in 2016. Then between 2017 into 2019 and 2020, the market saw growth upwards of 50% each year. And looking at the market through a currency lens, there was a clear spike in local currency issuances as a share of total issuances during the review period. This can generally be attributed to the impact of large-scale social COVID-19 issuance, particularly from the PRC, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand. Less than half of ASEAN+3 economies, namely the PRC, Japan, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, account for the majority of local currency sustainable debt issuance. Thailand has the largest share of local currency bonds among its total debt overall, at almost 99% denominated in Thai baht. On the other hand, Hong Kong, China, Indonesia, the Republic of Korea, the Philippines, and Vietnam issue the majority of their sustainable debt in foreign currencies. Vietnam is a standout in this regard, with just over 96% of its sustainable debt denominated in foreign currencies, while the Philippines has a more balanced share of around 54%. Next slide, please, Selena. The publication also acknowledges that local currency capital markets in the region are at various stages of development across the various different economies. Respective legal and policy frameworks vary, as does the extent of sustainable finance market development. As climate change and social issues transcend national boundaries, cross-border collaboration can undoubtedly play a critical role in the region's collective response to these issues. A few regional developments worthy of mention include the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, version 1, launched by the ASEAN Taxonomy Board, which is a significant step towards meeting Paris Agreement commitments by establishing a common language for financing sustainable economic activities. Also, the ASEAN+3 Central Banks Initiative on ASEAN Sustainable Banking Principles to help central banks in the region further develop sustainable banking guidelines. And also in 2021, ADB took the important step of launching the Green Recovery Platform to support ASEAN member countries realize their climate ambitions in the face of increasing climate and economic vulnerability. The publication also summarizes some of the key actions that take place within the respective markets and economies themselves. There are several regulatory developments and incentive measures, and I can't possibly go through all of them within this short presentation, but a few key developments worth mentioning at this time are the Green Bond Endorsed Catalogue, the 2021 edition, to unify green bond assets in the standards in the PRC. Further work on taxonomies is also underway in Malaysia, as evidenced by the SCM's release of its consultation paper on principle-based SRI taxonomy. Also in Thailand, the Sustainable Finance Initiatives for Thailand recommends 5 key strategic initiatives, the first of which is to develop a practical taxonomy. Next slide, please, Selena. When assessing the critical impediments to future growth in sustainable finance within the region, it's important to again reiterate that the ASEAN+3 market is not homogeneous, and the stage of market development varies across the economies, such as differing degrees of sophistication and market depth and development overall. Therefore, the degree to which each barrier affects the respective economies will also vary. However, there is an opportunity for each of these countries to learn from one another. It's also worth mentioning that many of the barriers that are listed on this slide here are also common to many GSS markets across the globe. So in some instances, other markets and regions can provide important lessons to the ASEAN+3 region. In a section of the report, we've actually investigated some potential lessons that could be learned from these other markets, such as Brazil, and also other regions, such as the Nordic region. Next slide, please, Selena. So across ASEAN+3, central governments and local governments aim to mobilize billions of dollars of capital for new public works projects. And while there's a variety of existing green infrastructure projects and assets in the region, there is a crucial need for all economies to invest further in projects that contribute to the long-term development goals, but also achieve the green transition. In particular, there's a need for such green investment to be conducted in local currencies to foster sustainable debt market growth, minimize long-term risks of hard currency issuance, and also engage existing local investors and capital markets. In the report, we've focused on 4 key sectors, namely renewable energy, low carbon transport, sustainable water management, and sustainable waste management. And although not included in these segments, the region is also host to a number of green projects in other sectors such as green buildings, sustainable agriculture and forestry, as well as tourism. We've also listed several hallmark issuances to highlight the potential that is in the region, such as UITM's solar power green SRI Sukuk issuance from April 2018 to the value of 222 million Malaysian ringgit, which financed the construction of a 50 megawatt solar power plant, but importantly represented the first university worldwide to issue a green sukuk. Next slide, please, Selena. We concluded the report by listing out several recommendations for the region to address bottlenecks to attracting additional investment in green finance and other financing opportunities. Firstly, on the supply side, we encourage further sovereign GSS bond issuances to help channel sustainable capital flows where they are most needed. Looking more closely at the unlabeled or climate-aligned universe can help highlight further investment opportunities that are not explicitly labeled as green by the issuer, but still finance climate-aligned activities and assets. Advisory services to support new issuers with limited sustainable finance experience and to help address market misperceptions that GSS bonds carries considerably higher costs, grant schemes to encourage sustainable finance flows, and also green project pipelines and associated green finance, which can be aided by policy and institutional changes. Next slide, please, Selena, where we talk also about the demand and ecosystem side, where expanding the investor base to capitalize on increasing demand from institutional investors seeking sustainable investment opportunities, a build back better approach by central banks to protect the ASEAN+3 member states from future systemic risks, including climate-related risks, ETFs and indices, which increase investor awareness and participation in sustainable bond markets, and then lastly, more broader mandates from governments and regulators to support as supportive mechanisms to encourage GSS bond issuance, and lastly, GSS and sustainable finance platforms to centralize information on green assets and other projects which can be made available in multiple languages. In closing, the ASEAN+3 sustainable finance market has continued to evolve beyond the pandemic, with heightened attention on many different sustainability themes. Most ASEAN+3 economies have issued at least one GSS instrument to date, with the local currency sustainable bond market growing at around 50% each year up into 2020. There are increases in both supply and demand of GSS bonds from a variety of different sources, and several policies and actions have helped to progress the local currency sustainable market. As a next step, we suggest all stakeholders to consider how they can best support these markets in these regions using the recommendations listed and provided in the report. Thanks very much for that.
Thank you, Daniel. Sean?
Selena, over to you. I'm about now, but I just want to tell everyone, Selena Champion is our head of international programs at Asia Pacific, the Climate Bonds Initiative, and we are so lucky that she's joined us early this year to help organise our program. So I just want to say thank you, Selena, for having joined us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for that kind introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I have a great panel here. Following on Daniel's presentation on CBI's overview on ASEAN bond market, and especially the local currency, what we have here is we have an investor, we have an intermediary, a regulator, and we have ADB sharing their perspective on how we can further enhance the size of this local currency market in ASEAN. I'm going to start the ball going with inviting Jason. Jason, thanks so much for joining us. Jason, from an investor point of view, I think the reality is no matter how effective the landscape is or how the quality of the issuances are, this is very much driven by investors. As Daniel has shown, the market has significantly grown in ASEAN. And could you tell us from an investor perspective, what do you think were the trigger points to sort of drive that interest?
Thanks very much. Yeah, it's really exciting to see the growth that we're seeing now in the ASEAN+3 GSS bond space. I mean, just looking over the numbers, pretty much issuance since 2021, I see about 100 local currency issues now just in ASEAN. So, you know, and a good mix of both dollar and foreign currencies. You know, I think it's really important that we do, as this report pointed out, build that local currency market for market deepening and to bolster the sophistication of these markets, which really is going to take, I think, to be quite honest, a lot more lift from the local investors. You know, one of the things that is, I think, important to note about local currency, emerging market local currency space is that, you know, while you do have, you know, involvement from foreign investors, and those flows can be quite significant at certain times during the investment cycle, you know, really this is, you know, for most foreign investors, local currency bonds are pretty much the in the outer orbit of kind of risk taking that an institutional investor can take. Typically, it's done in hard currency space when there is an emerging market allocation. So especially in Asia, I think, you know, the good news is it's going to take those local investors to step up to really grow this market. But thankfully, in a lot of these markets, we do actually have quite a strong a local investor base, both in pension funds, life insurance, and in some certain cases like the Philippines, you know, quite a lot of banks that are also involved in these capital markets. So to answer your question about why is this such an exciting area for us, you know, I think you know, if you think about it, the trend in ESG investing, which really started out as, you know, kind of a bit of a niche, and why would this be important for investors or even for fixed income investors for that matter? And we've kind of moved beyond the point where you know, ESG scores or kind of this level of ESG research is kind of going to cut it. Now investors, quite rightly, and society in general, wants to see results. And thankfully, we have this amazing structure on the fixed income side, green bonds, for example, where we can say, yes, indeed, based on the money that we've invested, that these are the impacts that have resulted, you know, done up in a recognized and high quality framework. So this, I think, is really the demand to see those impacts, to see that the result of the investment. That, I think, is one of the big drivers between the growing interest on the investor side. And certainly, you know, from the COVID pandemic and then this year as new types of bonds have emerged, I think that the demand side, or sorry, the supply side also, and regulators and policymakers are understanding that these bonds can really be quite useful to plugging the gaps, and in some cases in a very short period of time, raising a lot of capital to throw at very large problems that we face, such as COVID, and going forward, increasingly climate change. So, you know, to kind of wrap it up, what's exciting about ASEAN and Asian green bonds in particular, you know, if you think about it from an impact perspective, the way that we measure these things is typically based on, you know, what is the baseline level of emissions, for example, in the energy sector. In certain, you know, France or in kind of other developed countries, in some cases, you know, they've already decarbonized to quite a large degree. Whereas we know that the decarbonization of energy in emerging markets, especially in Asia, is just such a huge opportunity and a challenge. So when you are investing in these types of bonds, you know, the impact that you can get can actually be quite enormous in terms of efficiency of, you know, impact per dollar. So this is a space that we want to see grow. And you know, where it makes sense for our investors and our investment strategies, certainly want to be playing a part in. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. You're absolutely right. The trajectory of growth in this region is phenomenal, assuming that we have all the frameworks in place and the economic policies in place to trigger that shift. On that note, can I please invite Ivy? Ivy, could you sort of share your experience from an intermediary point of view? Like Jason says, that for the local currency market to grow, we need a larger domestic investor base. In your experience, do you see any major barriers that have been limiting the growth of domestic investor base in this region?
Thank you, Selena. I think Jason rightly highlighted, some of the opportunity and challenges in this market. And I think among all the challenges that the issuers are facing, I think one of which stand out more prominently would be, the knowledge required to establish their own sort of ESG financing framework, and also the disclosure around their issuance. And I think the emerging market in sustainable finance do present some of the some opportunities and drivers, I would say. For example, right now we are talking about sustainability linked structure. So under the sustainability linked loan principle, ESG scoring is actually one of the KPI category that the issuer can benchmark with. So I think that will certainly sort of incentivize the issuer to look at the ESG rating and have some thinking around that. But again, ESG disclosure could be like a daunting task to many of the local issuers. And I think right now the local market is still like kind of lacking guidelines and some sort of best practices for the local issuers to make reference to. So I think ESG disclosure could be something that the policymakers and of course the ADB and like other institution could provide the issuers with more guidance, hand-holding, assistance would certainly be helpful. Another challenges that I observe among the potential issuers is the how to define eligible green or social or slash sustainability projects. I agree with Daniel's presentation. I think one of the challenges that he mentioned is, in this market, there are lack of bankable green or social sustainability projects. I think one of the reason behind would be, I think the definition right now are still sort of lagging like a consistency there. I appreciate that the ASEAN Taxonomy Board is currently working very hard to get the regional taxonomy out the market, and I think there's like the multi-tier approach which is trying to address the different local contexts in the ASEAN region, which is I think a very sort of a good direction, given I think right now the global market, when they talk about definition, I think EU taxonomy is the most talk about set of taxonomy. But I think going forward, if in ASEAN we can have our own taxonomy, that will definitely help our issuers to move faster, and in terms of identifying the eligible projects. And I can give you an example, like if we talk about waste to energy projects. So right now, under the EU taxonomy, it is not allowed. But if you think about from a more local perspective, given the recycling technologies are not that advanced yet, so waste to energy, this kind of project definitely will have a role to play, at least for a period of time. So I think if the ASEAN taxonomy could give more guidance around this kind of eligibility, I think it will definitely help the issuers to accelerate and find the right direction for structuring their sustainable finance instruments. I'll pause here.
Thanks a lot, Ivy. I think major points that echo throughout all markets in ASEAN that I've encountered with is there is a lack of understanding, lack of knowledge, lack of experience, lack of expertise, unable to define what are the eligible projects. And this is where a perfect segue to bring you in, Kelvin. As a regulator, I think we all fall back on the regulator to provide that facilitative landscape and that guidance. Could you please share with us what Philippines SEC has done to create that vibrancy in Philippines?
Thank you, Selena. Well, I can only speak for the Philippines. I hesitate to give you the perspective of my other fellow regulators in other jurisdictions. But so far, what we've been doing, at least here in the Philippines, we've been trying to make sure that the GSS bonds and then, of course, sustainable financing of the like is a possibility here, is a priority here, in fact. Just to quickly list to you some of the things we have already done. We issued the guidelines on the issuance of green bonds following the ASEAN Green Bond Standards. We did the same for the social bonds under the ASEAN Social Bond Standards. We did the same for the ASEAN Sustainability Bond Standards. And we also had the Sustainability Reporting Guidelines. All these issued by the SEC now in the span of the last few years. And this has created the basic framework from which most of the GSS issuances of the Philippines has come from. And Daniel has shown some of our numbers. I would like to think that our numbers are a little better than that, but I realize that the focus, of course, is on the local currency side. So I understand why the numbers are like that. But the numbers that have been presented to me at the SEC level is that we're actually roughly around second in ASEAN. We're only second to Thailand, as I understand it, now in terms of the total GSS bond issuances that we have done. But of course, Daniel's numbers are based on local currency, so I'm not going to contest that. No, so no worries. I guess the point is, for me, I just want to emphasize that among regulators, and I'm sure we want to encourage other regulators to focus on that, to work and then try and create the appropriate framework to encourage these bonds to come out, these issuances to come out. In fact, if I could just bring up one more, we also have one more rule. I think we have another rule coming up. The proposed rules on sustainable and responsible investment funds, which is roughly along the same lines. And back on the point on our sustainability reporting guidelines, I forgot to mention that we're all currently using it on a comply or explain basis. We intend to make it mandatory, hopefully by next year. So I guess what's my point? But basically, I guess sometimes it behooves upon the regulator to be the one to take the first step. Sometimes it comes to us to be able to take the challenge, move forward, and try to what's a polite word to say? Try to force the issue. Try to make everyone focus their capital, or at least make the capital flow in a certain area that will make a difference for not just for us, but for the world, for our kids, in the future. I'll pause there before I say too much, because once I start getting into this, I tend to I tend to say something off topic and I might get in trouble. Back to you, Selena.
No problem, Kelvin. I think that's an issue most regulators have already been faced. Do you provide the carrot, or do you use the stick when it comes to sustainable finance? On that note, Pok, if I could invite you into the conversation and share ADB's experience. I mean, your presence in the region has been profound. You've worked in all the regions. And given the fact that we have now heard what the issuers face, they struggle with, what investors are looking for, and what are the regulatory landscapes that are being developed or have been developed. In your opinion, what can the smaller economies who've not started this journey as yet learn from the larger economies within ASEAN+3?
Yeah, thank you, Serena. So, speaking after a regulator, so I would say that one of the good lessons learned is that the regulator need to have a very clear message, that they want to prioritize the sustainable bond market development, and they also need to have strong support for the local stakeholders as well. Because if you look at the numbers, I think it's not in the report, but before 2017, before the launch of the ASEAN Green, Social, and Sustainability Bond Standard, we didn't see that many green bonds issued in ASEAN back then. But as soon as the standards were launched by the ACMF, or the ASEAN Capital Market Forum, we saw a huge jump on the issuances. So, I would say the strong guidance, by the regulators, is something that's very important, and particularly for small countries. And the support from the regulators, I think that could address all the pain points that all the speakers has just mentioned. On the supply side, being supported by regulators, I think having the market champion, the issuer who is willing to come forward to issue the first bond or the pilot GSS bond in their respective country, I think this is something very important. Of course, in doing so, many countries would need capacity building support to their local stakeholders, to the underwriters, to the issuers, even to the investors. This is something where the ADB, in collaboration with the local stakeholders or regulators, can help. All right, and also especially for smaller countries where the bond market development is at the very early stage of development. Of course, as Sean mentioned earlier, ADB also provide a guarantee facility for first-time issuers to come to the market. And for issuers in ASEAN+3, we also have the CGIF, the Credit Guarantee and Investment Facility, and under the ABMI that Tomo-san just mentioned, which is owned by the ASEAN+3 government to help issuers to issue the bonds. So that's something that they can also consider using as well to help increase the supply of the local currency sustainable bonds in their country. And also on my second point on the demand side, I would say the role of the public investors is extremely important, right? So investors are reluctant to issue the bonds unless they know that there's a demand for it, right? And this is where the public investors can play a role. Pension funds, social security funds, even central banks, can support. And I think most recently, one example is the Employees Provident Fund in Malaysia. Just a few months ago, launched a sustainable savings option for their members. I think this is a very good example for the provident fund in other countries. I mean, we could have this, we could make this a default option for existing members or for new members joining the fund. That would unlock, more private capital to the investments in, GSS bonds. So I think there are a few examples that smaller countries could follow, and I think this is something that the ADB together with the ABMI and also the ASEAN+3 members can of course collaborate and also to share our experience. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. As a native Malaysian, I echo your sentiment in terms of how EPF has moved the agenda further in Malaysia by providing these options and putting in rigorous requirements for SRI investments and how they've engaged with their funds as well. Jason, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now, because fundamentally what we've seen from different angles that a lot of effort is being put into place to help issuers come to the forefront with their issuances. But the reality is, as you mentioned it just now, that for a local currency market to progress or do well in this side of the world, we need a higher presence of domestic investors. And as Pok alluded, the domestic investors need to step up their public funds that should prioritize sustainable investments and start looking at investments in the region. In your experience, what are the kind of lessons they could learn from the more developed markets? What should investors be looking at, and how do they address issues like Daniel mentioned, lower credit ratings, limited variety of pipeline projects? How do investors in developed markets have dealt with these issues?
Sure. So, most of my experience has been, at the Japanese asset manager looking at these markets. But what I can tell, kind of, having followed this for a few years now, it does seem like, the green bond market, as we know, tends to start out, with agency issues. Kind of quasi-governmental agencies tend to kind of lead the issuance, supranationals, of course, to establish kind of a beachhead, and then you tend to see more corporates once this concept is better known and better accepted, and there's more kind of organic demand in the market. For me, it seems like, and I think we're seeing signs of this happening now, that for Asia, which does have a lot of kind of agencies attached to the various governmental issuers, that is a perfect place to be issuing infrastructure related, energy related, big ticket, really can only be financed through the debt capital markets kinds of projects. with the imprimatur or nearly there of the sovereign, for sort of the credit enhancement, and also with a big enough size and a pipeline that it will make sense for the issuer as well as for the investor, because increasingly now that this market is deepening, we do want to see not just a one-off green bond or social bond, but want to see a pipeline of that, and kind of see it become a green or a social issuer. And I think that we've seen that in certain spaces, and I believe that there are probably a lot of public, especially public, pension money, for example, in ASEAN, that I'm sure is able to and is going to be looking at these kinds of markets. So once you have that established, I think that then you can start looking at building out more of the corporate market, which is certainly of the greatest interest for investors, active investors like us. Respecting, of course, the fact that not every market has an enormous and kind of corporate debt market like you have in the US, for example. I mean, even in Japan, it's relatively small compared to the government and agency side. So these things do take time, but you got to, I think, play to your strengths. And I do see a lot of potential both on the supply side and the demand side for that type of sort of agency-led infrastructure and energy type of debt. So that seems to be a good one. From an investor side as well, what I'd like to say is, at least from what we're doing, we understand that there's differences in the level of sophistication and the level that these various issuers are familiar with this. I mean, we ourselves are learning a lot about how to look at green bonds and how to assess them. So you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be perfect the first time. You don't have to put out a 55-page impact report. Just hit the right notes. Tell us how much carbon you reduced. Make it very clear. Put it somewhere on the website where we can find it very, very easily. This is another thing it's kind of amazing to me that this is still 2022 and we're still kind of having to track these things down. So hard to do. But just get those basics right, and the investment dollars or ringgit or whatever it is will come. It's not just about kind of green bond funds anymore. I think this is really, and we see this is going mainstream in mainstream portfolios. The market is deepening and expanding to the point where, in some cases you don't even know that you're buying. Well, some investors may not even know that they're buying the green bond. We're looking at ways to, not necessarily at the level of 100% green bond funds, but a very, very significant portion of the fund, while still delivering, we think, attractive levels of spread and yield to our investors at the right risk. That I think is going to be the way that we can really mainstream this structure in Asia. So I would look that, first, again, agencies to lead that, and to see some more sovereign. They can pull this off and really get the market familiar with the structure, and then the corporates, the biggest corporates can commit to issuing a pipeline of green or social. I think that would really be the best pathway forward for this region. Thanks.
Thanks, Jason. Ivy, a great point that Jason made. I think it goes back to your point about disclosures as well. I think if issuers are able to disclose not once a year or not particularly to a particular bond issuance, but generally disclose their transition journey on their public platforms, I think that will help investors get the right kind of information. But I'm going to switch the conversation a little bit slightly, Ivy, going back to the issuer point of view. In your opinion, what kind of other regulations should the governments come out with, economic policies, or should the capital market come out with to further facilitate, besides the existing taxonomies, guidance in terms of disclosures? What else do you think that needs to be taken in place to trigger the market to the next level of growth?
Sure, thanks, Selena. I think from a capital market point of view, I think we definitely need more demonstration issuance. And I think I'm very glad to see that a lot of sovereign issuance in this ASEAN region took place over the last couple of years. But I think so far the focus is more on green. So if going forward, there could be more sovereign issuance on social, or even like SLB, just like Chile just did one, I think that will be fantastic, because I think the market is still trying to, turn to some really best practices and try to learn from others' experience. So I think sovereign issuers would definitely play this significant role. And I think the other reason that I think sovereign issuance is vital to the the growth of sustainable finance market in ASEAN is that in this region we have some specific social issues to address, like gender equality, like just transition, etc. And we need guidance indeed, to show us how to kind of identify the eligible project in the first place, and how to demonstrate that these social projects would lead to really significant impact, and what sort of best practices around social impact disclosure. I think this kind of guidance is really is very much needed from issuers' perspective. And I think from product design, I think recently we've seen the Hong Kong SAR government, they issue an inflation-linked green bond, which I think is also an example of innovation, and perhaps this could be something that could incentivize the investor community a little bit in this region.
Okay, thank you, Ivy. Calvin, I'm going to bring you in on this point. I think Ivy made a fair point. We've got all the regulatory frameworks when it comes to green, although there's a lack of understanding in the market, that understanding is growing. But for the ASEAN region in itself, +3, to move forward, transition is becoming a bigger issue. There are other issues, social issues, and everything else that are becoming a priority. In your experience, what should the regulator be doing going forward to recognize that there's a wider definition of labels and themes that we're looking at? And, given the structural issues like issuance costs, higher issuance costs, lower credit ratings, what kind of, how do you see the regulator moving forward in that sense?
Well, I can't speak for, once again, I can't speak for my other fellow regulators in other jurisdictions, but I can tell you, at least in the Philippines, we have been trying to keep an open mind about all this. Now, we're trying to also be careful moving forward, because the basic issuances, as I mentioned, we've already been aggressive about releasing all these different issuances already and guidelines prior to that. But now we're at that stage where green, GSS, Green Social Sustainable Fund guidelines are already there. So that sets the standard for everything else. Moving forward, the more technical side of things, we're trying to be a little more careful now. For instance, I don't know if this is a little off topic, but recently there was a request to meet me to discuss blue bonds, the possibility of issuing a blue bond framework. I recall at the time my direction was that, and per advice of my staff, we did not want to commit to the issuance of blue bond frameworks, precisely because this goes back to, I think it was, I forget if it was Daniel or Jason who mentioned it, Daniel or Jason's point, that a lot of people still don't quite understand what some of these things are, the green bonds and the blue bonds. So, the green bonds and the sustainability bonds. And it turns out, from my understanding, blue bonds could actually, depending on how it's tagged, could actually fall under already green bonds, under the green bond guidelines or the sustainability bond guidelines, depending on what the projects are involved. So it's things like this that we have to be more careful about. We have to be, but at the same time, we have to keep an open mind. We still want these things to happen. We still want to help encourage issuers to continue to continue to proceed with their issuance. And so I guess that's one thing we're doing here at the Philippine SEC. We are continuing our work. We are trying to keep an open mind, but of course, a little more carefully, considering a lot of the things that we're doing now moving forward are newer. The blue bonds is one example. Some other examples I could probably name would be, we've recently received requests in relation to, once again, not quite on point, but in relation to carbon markets, for instance. There are, of course, going to be some issues as to what regulations will apply for us on that. Do we issue new ones, things like that. So I guess it's a roundabout way of saying that we try, once again, to keep an open mind, I guess is what I can tell you at this point. But we, at the same time, treading carefully. I guess I hope that kind of answers the question.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to give up too much now, because I have a fair number of stuff that I'm realizing now while I was answering that I can't quite mention publicly yet. Sorry.
No problem, Calvin. I think the whole journey in the green finance space started with renewable energy, and I think everyone's trying to broaden the breadth of issuances that we have. But how broad do you provide definitions? Does that add to the ambiguity and the lack of understanding?
Exactly. That's a good
yeah.
point, Selena. Precisely. What my worry in particular, for instance, it's not that I don't want blue bonds to be issued, for instance. I would be very interested in having those issued. But would it not just lead to more ambiguity? We come up with a separate blue bond framework, which already might overlap, for instance, with the green bond issuances, or sorry, green bond guidelines that we have, or sustainability bond guidelines that we have. So there is that push and pull. No? We also run the risk of overregulation. I also used to handle corporate governance. I was once accused of overregulating in that field, for instance. So there is that difficulty of regulating, of being a regulator. The push and pull, the challenge, the delicate balance is always very difficult to work on. Sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, not at all. Absolutely right. There's always a balance between regulating the market and developing the market. And how do you ensure that balance and still allow the market to grow organically? Thank you, Calvin. Pok, we have 3 minutes left, so I'm going to have to lay the last question to you, Pok. Talking about broadening the investment opportunities, what kind of industries do you see that have potential to be issuing green, sustainable, and social bonds coming forward in this region?
Thanks, Selena. We have recently conducted a survey in some of the ASEAN countries. In fact, we are still finalizing the report for these countries. And one of the questions that we asked both the investors as well as the underwriters in these countries is that what do you see as the most promising sectors for green bond issuance? And of course, based on what I have seen, most of them responded that renewable energy would be seen as the sector with most promising in almost all of the countries responded. And this also reflects the views from both the investors and also the underwriters as well. And other than that, we also see some responses on the low carbon transportation, given the need for massive infrastructure investment needs in this region. And also we saw some countries thinking that the green buildings could be seen as the most potential. In fact, we are discussing with some of the potential issuers in these sectors as well. And of course, for the case of Thailand, the government came out with the BCG policy, bio-circular and green economic model. So we also seen some issuers, that would be interested in using the proceeds for recycling, reuse of the materials. That's something that we are also seeing in the market. So in case of ADB, no matter what sectors they are, as Tomo-san mentioned at his opening remarks, we have some resources to support the issuers. And as I said, we are here to help to increase the supply of the sustainable bonds in the region. And also, we have seen some of the countries in the region, Malaysia, Singapore, Hong Kong, that came out with the grant schemes, to support the external review fees for sustainable bond issuers or sukuk issuers. But the important point is that, many of the issuers, they don't know how to issue the bond. As you mentioned earlier, Selena, there are companies that don't know whether their existing projects or expenditures would meet the green or social or sustainability bond standards. So that's where ADB could come in as an initial step, working with the underwriters, working with the issuers to help identify what these eligible assets are, and also to provide some guidance on how the framework should be developed, and also to facilitate the discussion with the external reviewers as well. Because all these processes are new for the issuers as well as for the underwriters. And I think that, with this kind of support, that would enable them to later on apply for the subsidies from the government. I think that's where ADB could fill the gap. And also, we are collaborating with the CBI, of course, to develop the local green bond verifiers. We have supported 3 verifiers from ASEAN. We feel that having someone on the ground who speaks the same language as the issuers, underwriters, work in the same time zone, of course, and who understand the market environment would actually help to expedite market development. And with the experts on the ground, of course, we would be able to broaden the sectors of the issuers who can issue the bond. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pok. I think those are low-hanging fruits that we all could sort of focus on in the next few years. But the exciting thing that I would like to sort of bring up is the industrial transition. I think that will be an interesting shift in how the economies in this side of the world could actually make a difference. On that note, I'd like to thank all my panelists, thank all the speakers for joining us, and thank the audience for joining us. As far as I'm concerned, this was a great conversation. Thank you so much. And I'm afraid we didn't have a time to answer all the questions in the Q&A chat group, but we will do so post this event when we post the webinar. Thank you. Thank you all very